Hey guys, tonight we wade quite literally into the squishy, mysterious world of ancient Egyptian flood watching. You're standing on the banks of the Nile, barefoot, because shoes are a rookie move here. Mud squelches between your toes. The air smells like wet reeds, distant dung, and something oddly sweet, probably rotting dates. You look up, and the river stretches before you, wide and sleepy for now, but don't get too cozy. In a few weeks, that calm surface will swell and surge, swallowing fields and sometimes entire villages like a drunk uncle at a family buffet. You'll be chest deep in water, if you're lucky, and if you're not, well, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where are you listening from and what time is it right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the edge of a papyrus thicket, flicking a mosquito off your arm. The Nile looks calm today, but every villager knows it's just holding its breath, because in ancient Egypt, where cats have legal immunity and onions are currency, the Nile isn't just a river. It's the life source, the boss, the drama queen. Each year, sometime around late June, the waters begin to rise. Not fast, just a little bulge here, a widening trickle there. But by August, if the gods are in a good mood, that river is no longer something you can hop across with a running start. It spreads over its banks and stretches its arms deep into the fields, laying down rich, black silt that makes crops grow like magic. That's the dream. But some years, it rises too much, flooding homes and drowning granaries. Other years, it barely sloshes past the river bank, and farmers start praying to any deity who listen. And this is where you come in. Not as a priest or a king, not even a humble fishmonger. You're a farmer, just a regular guy trying to grow barley and keep your goat from eating the laundry. And your entire life depends on knowing how high will the river rise this year. But here's the catch. You don't have a weather app, no satellite imagery, not even a guy in a robe yelling predictions from a mountaintop. All you got is your eyes, your gut, and a very, very important stick. Well, okay, not just a stick with lines carved into it. You and your neighbors call it a millimeter. It's your version of a magic 8-ball, but with slightly more life and death implications. You shove it into the Nile at the same spot every morning, and the water creeps up like a secret. If it passes line 6, that's good. Line 8, that's really good. But line 10 means get your boat ready and maybe say goodbye to your basement goats. The Nile's flood cycle isn't just weather, it's prophecy, politics, and economic forecasting rolled into one. This annual swell is so central to Egyptian life that entire temples are built around watching it. Imagine building a cathedral just to track your local tide chart. But here, it makes sense. The river gives you grain. The grain feeds your family. And fun twist, the government taxes you based on how much they think you'll harvest. That's right, taxes, but make it spiritual. There's a mainstream fact for you. Ancient Egyptians designed some of the earliest known water measurement systems, predating modern hydrology by thousands of years. Millimeters were often built near temples, which helped reinforce the idea that the gods, not just rainfall, controlled the floods. Of course, the priests had a few tricks up their sleeves, but we'll get to that later. Right now, all you care about is what that stick says. You wake before dawn, squint at the notches, and yell across the field, 5 1/4. The baker next door sighs and mutters something about to dry for ducks. There's even a guy in the village who swears his left knee starts itching at exactly 7 cubits. And for fingers, but historians still argue whether these human barometers were superstition or just weirdly effective meteorologists. Of course, not everyone measures the same way. There's your uncle who insists his grandfather's flood pole is more accurate, even though it's clearly just a broken spear. Another farmer uses a bronze measuring rod that looks suspiciously like something stolen from a temple. Still, no one trusts him, mostly because he also claims to have talked to a fish once. But the truth is, you all depend on that water. It's not just about farming, it's about timing. If the flood is coming late, you might plant too early and lose your crop. If it comes too soon, you might not even have your field cleared. It's like playing roulette, but with sand and onions. Some nights, you lie awake and listen. The river makes sounds, gentle gurgles, occasional groans. Some say the Nile speaks to those who really listen. Others say that's just the frogs getting rowdy after dark. Oh, and here's a French tidbit to chew on. Certain inscriptions suggest that during especially unpredictable years, villagers would toss tiny, model boats into the river as offerings, not just to ask for a better flood, but maybe to bribe the Nile itself. Because when your fate depends on a river's mood swings, a little wooden canoe seems like a fair trade for good harvest vibes. You check your stick again the next morning. The water has risen barely, maybe half a finger. You squint at the sky, clouds to the south. That's good. Rain in Ethiopia means more Nile love for Egypt. Still, you wonder, will it be enough? And just like that, you realize something. You're not just watching a river, you're part of a system ancient, improvised, and weirdly elegant where survival depends on a carved stick and a whole lot of hope. You wake to the sound of splashing soft, steady, and close before your eyes even open. You know it's the Nile again, creeping in like it owns the place. You stumble out of your mud brick home, still half dreaming, and there it is. The river has risen another finger width overnight. You yawn, stretch, and try not to think about how many bugs you just swallowed in your sleep. The whole village is already up. Well, not everyone old Muref's still snoring in his grain shed, but most of the farmers are gathered by the bank. They squat beside their measuring sticks, eyes narrowed, hands on knees, trying to act casual about it. But there's tension in the air. It's like waiting for exam results, except if you fail. Your entire field dies and your kids start eating reeds for dinner. You shuffle over and sit beside your own water stick, now glossy with morning dew and river foam. You planted this stick yourself years ago. It's not fancy, just a cedar rod with careful notches for every cubit and finger, but it's yours. You trust it more than your neighbors, more than the taxman, maybe even more than your own goats. The Nile has moods, and the people who farm its banks, they learn to read its whispers. One glance at the foam's color tells you whether it carried rich black silt or just angry floodwater. A handful of mud rubbed between your fingers lets you guess whether it'll grow barley or nothing but shame. You've learned to sniff the breeze for the scent of southern rain, to watch how fast the papyrus bends in the afternoon heat. One frog croaking after sundown? Normal. 10 frogs croaking in unison. Call the priest. You chuckle at that one partly because it's true. No joke. Frogs are flood indicators here. Their sudden activity is like a calendar alarm, even ancient. Egyptian artwork shows those tiny amphibian prophets hopping around just before the waters rise. There's even one offbeat temple inscription that refers to a council of frogs, probably a poetic metaphor, or maybe a misinterpreted prank by some cheeky scribe. Historians still argue whether frogs were seen as sacred flood predictors or just very noisy roommates. A boy from the next farm over jogs by, holding a pot of water and a smug look. 7 fingers up, he shouts to anyone listening. A few heads snap up. A murmur runs through the group that's higher than expected. You glance at your own stick again. Maybe the Nile's feeling generous today. Maybe, but you've seen it trick people before. The villagers aren't just checking levels for fun. There's a system here, unofficial, but deeply trusted. You all compare sticks, talk about trends, swap tips. It's like a sleepy, sun-baked version of a weather conference. Each farm has its own stick, its own measurements, its own old timer who swears by a different method. One guy claims he can feel the flood in his teeth. Another insists the fish change flavor when the water starts rising. That one might just be an excuse for bad cooking, though the river's current shifts slightly. You squint and notice a faint line of darker foam weaving through the surface debris from upstream, or maybe the first signs of true floodwater. That's how subtle it starts, and only those who live with the river day after day learn to see it. Back in the old days, like really old, when farming first took hold here, during the pre-dynastic period, there weren't even flood sticks. People just guessed. That's probably how they ended up with so many wild myths. Some early farmers believed the Nile's flood was caused by a giant sky cow crying once a year. No joke, honestly, that version might be more emotionally relatable than the real explanation, which involves rainfall in Ethiopia and 1,000 miles of topography. Eventually, someone smart, probably a woman, let's be real, noticed a pattern. Hey, she might have said, when the water hits this rock, our barley grows taller. Boom. Science. From there, it was only a matter of time before someone stuck a rod in the river and started marking it. By the time you're living in this moment, it's become almost ritual. Wake up, check the stick, record the level maybe. Not with writing, but with memory, scratches on stone, or in the rhythm of a harvest song. Over time, That little cedar rod by your field grows in importance until it becomes something else entirely. A local millimeter, you lean over and add a new notch to your stick. Just a scratch, really, but it matters. If the water keeps rising at this rate, the flood will be decent, not great, but manageable. You could afford a new plow. Maybe even enough beer to stop fighting with your cousin about who stole whose. Go last month. One of the elders walks by, dragging his own stick like a staff. He looks at yours, squints and grunts, same as mine. He mutters, then he adds, better pray it stays steady, to high and the worms come. You shiver. You've seen what happens when the flood gets greedy. Whole farms turn to slop. Foundations sunk into the muck. Rats taking over like tiny landlords. No thanks. And yet, when the flood comes just right, it's beautiful. The water spreads out like a silver mirror, glittering under the morning sun. Birds circle. Fish leap. The fields drink deeply, and for a moment, everything feels possible. Like the Nile isn't just a river, it's a promise, a seasonal handshake from nature. You sit beside your measuring stick a little longer, listening. The river gurgles softly, telling you its secrets if you're patient enough to hear. Not everyone understands the intimacy of it. You don't just watch the Nile. You court it. You listen. You learn. You remember. And maybe that's the real magic of flood sticks. Not that they predict disaster or bounty with perfect accuracy, but that they remind you to pay attention, to notice the slow creep of water on stone, the shift of silt underfoot, the frogs, the foam, the silence between floods. You sigh. Press your palm to the damp wood of your millimeter and whisper, easy. Does it? You're crouched at the river bank again, same spot, same squelchy mud, same faint smell of fish that died under mysterious circumstances. But today's different. Today, your fingers wrap around something that isn't just a stick anymore. It's a carved, polished, carefully notched measuring rod passed down through 3 generations of slightly paranoid farmers. Your grandfather called it life insurance. Your father added an extra notch during the year of the slippery flood, and now it's yours. You give the rod a little spin in your hand. It's about a cubit long, maybe a bit more, since the tip got chewed by goats one summer and made from acacia wood. Hard enough to poke into river muck without snapping like a cheap tent pole. It's marked with precise lines, each one representing part of the local cubit measurement system. Full cubits, half cubits, even fingers, and those lines, they're everything. They tell you if the flood is late, early, dangerous, or just delightfully average. You plunge the rod into the Nile's edge and count the wet lines. 6 full cubits and 1 finger. Not bad, not thrilling, but definitely not famine-worthy. Maybe enough barley to finally build that new granary/goat shed you've been dreaming about. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Ancient Egyptians used millimeters, yes. That's the real name for thousands of years to track the height of the annual Nile flood. Some were simple vertical poles or sticks like yours, stuck in the mud and monitored obsessively. Others were elaborate staircases or stone wells cut into rock, where water levels could be marked over centuries. The most famous one still exists, on Rhoda Island in Cairo, built in 861 CE, but based on the same ancient principles your grandfather swore by. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Right now, this humble carved rod is your tool, your calendar, your warning system. You check it every morning, like brushing your teeth, if brushing your teeth could also tell you whether your family was going to starve or thrive. Sometimes you joke about it with your neighbors. Nice stick, you say, nodding toward their gear. One guy's upgraded to a copper-tip model, claims it gives more accurate readings. You're not convinced. Another farmer's trying out painted notches blue for safe, red for panic, and start swimming. Everyone's got a theory, but at the end of the day, the stick is only as good as the hands using it. That doesn't stop the superstitions, though. You've seen one woman bless her measuring rod with beer before sticking it in. Another guy swears by licking his finger and pointing it at the wind before each reading. And only once you saw someone sacrifice a chicken near the water before jabbing his flood stick in. Fringe behavior? Definitely. But historians still argue whether these rituals were signs of desperation or part of a forgotten rural cult of the Nile. The truth is probably somewhere between folklore and wishful thinking. You run your thumb across one of the notches, 7 cubits. That's the magic number, a perfect flood, enough water to fertilize all the fields without drowning the roads or washing away your clay oven. That's what you hope for, what you pray for, what the tax collector expects. Ah yes, the tax collector. Here's where things get fun. See, flood levels weren't just about crops and grain. They were about money, or, well, grain-shaped money. The local officials used millimeter readings to estimate how much tax each village should owe. More flood, bigger harvest, bigger harvest, bigger tax bill. It was simple, brutal, and kind of genius, except when at WAS and single quotes T. one year, the flood hit 8 cubits, and everyone cheered until a sudden heat wave scorched the fields and left half the crops shriveled like yesterday's fish stew. You tried explaining that to the scribe who came to collect taxes. He just pointed at the stick marks on the temple's flood wall and said, 8 cubits. You owe 10 sacks of barley, you paid in onions, and regret dies. No wonder, then, that flood sticks took on a kind of mystical weight. They weren't just tools, they were tiny wooden oracles. You kept them safe, dry, sometimes hidden. People carved prayers into them. One old man in your village claims he buried his rod upright in the middle of his field during a drought, hoping it would attract rain like a ceremonial lightning rod. Spoiler alert, it didn't, but his field did become the go-to place for frogs that summer, which he took as a good omen. You glance at your stick again, still 6 and 1 finger, solid, predictable. You lean back, staring at the bright blue sky. If the readings keep like this, the flood will peak soon. Then the real work begins: plowing, planting, praying it doesn't all go sideways. But for now, you sit beside your carved measuring rod, proud in its simplicity. No gears, no bells, no apps. Just wooden notches and thousands of years of farmers, squinting at the Nile and muttering, is that higher than yesterday? Sometimes you wonder who invented it first. Was it a priest, a farmer, a bored shepherd who liked poking water? No one really knows. The oldest flood level inscriptions go back to around 3000 BCE, but people probably used sticks long before they figured out how to carve pretty pictures into limestone. You don't care who started it. You just care that it still works. The sun climbs higher. A warm breeze ruffles your tunic. You gather your measuring rod, wipe it clean, and tuck it into the holder by your door like it's a sword returning to its sheath. You know, you'll be back tomorrow and the day after that, and maybe, just maybe, you'll notch one more line this year. Because in ancient Egypt, when the Nile comes knocking, you answer with a carved stick in your hand. You're standing inside a cool stone chamber, dimly lit by the late morning sun slanting through a slit in the wall. The air smells faintly of incense, wet limestone, and that indefinable temple aroma somewhere between dusty dignity and goat. Your sandals scrape gently as you approach the far wall. There it is, a series of tiny notches carved into smooth granite, winding downward like a vertical timeline of watery mood swings. This isn't your humble village measuring stick anymore. You've been summoned to the big leagues, to the temple of Khnum, guardian of the Nile source, where priests and scribes gather to read the official flood data. You try to look casual, but your brain is screaming, do not touch anything holy or break anything carved. A barefoot scribe stands nearby, muttering to himself as he runs a thin reed pointer along the marks. He's got ink-stained fingers and a frown that could curdle beer. 6 cubits, 1 finger, he mutters, same as yesterday. Steady, boring. He dips his pen into ink made of soot and fish bladder, don't ask, and scribbles on a clay tablet. You glance down at the steps leading to the water shaft in the center of the room. They're ancient, worn smooth by centuries of sandals. The Nile listens far below, creeping into the shaft like a respectful guest. You can't help but marvel. This is a millimeter, a real one, built of stone, carved by experts, guarded by priests, and used to make decisions that ripple through an entire kingdom. Here's your mainstream fact. Temples across ancient Egypt, especially in Upper Egypt, had formal millimeters architectural installations built into the riverbanks or temple complexes. Some were staircases descending into the Nile. Others were wells or shafts with channels connected to the river. The idea: monitor the water level consistently and officially. Then use that measurement to inform royal taxes, planning schedules, and religious ceremonies. This place is serious business. The markings on the wall don't just show water height, they act like a holy barometer for the whole land. Each year, as the flood rises, priests track its progress day by day. When it reaches the ideal level, often 7 cubits, and some change, they announce it like a modern central bank releasing interest rates. Farmers celebrate, scribes sigh in relief, and tax collectors sharpen their papyrus scrolls. You lean closer to the wall, squinting at a series of older markings, tiny hieroglyphs etched beside a flood mark from a few decades ago. There's a story in the symbols. Year of the high waters, crops drowned, jackals feasted. So, not the best year, but not all the marks are grim. One line is decorated with a palm frond and a loaf of bread, a sign of abundance. Year of the fat, harvest. Someone scrawled beside it. You imagine the celebration, music, beer, maybe a goat roast if people were feeling bold. You glance at the scribe, who's now pacing beside a brass measuring pole, grumbling about poor alignment of Sirius. You raise an eyebrow. Excuse me, you say, isn't the measurement taken from the water's edge? He sighs and gives you a look like you just asked if the pyramids are hats. This is divine data. Farmer, he says, gesturing dramatically, we don't just measure water. We interpret the Nile's intentions, right? Of course, because in temple circles, water levels aren't just numbers. They're messages from the gods. Gnum, the ram-headed deity of the Nile source, is said to turn the wheel and release the annual flood. Some say he even sculpts children on a pottery wheel from clay and river water. Because why settle for just being a god, when you can also be the world's oldest arts and crafts teacher? That's where the fringe comes in, a few dusty scrolls. Hidden deep in temple libraries mention floods being influenced by celestial alignments, particularly the rising of the star Sirius. Priests would use astronomical observations to predict the flood, often with suspicious accuracy. Historians still argue whether this was real science, divine luck, or just extremely smart pattern recognition mixed with confident mumbling. But here's the part no one likes to admit. The priests had a lot riding on their measurements. If the flood was too low and the people starved, the gods would look weak. If the tax estimates were off, scribes got blamed. So sometimes, just sometimes, the official readings were adjusted. A half cubit here, a finger there. After all, who's going to argue with the guys who speak for the gods? You step aside as the younger scribes walk in, carrying a new water staff for the measuring shaft. It's shiny and straight, probably bronze-capped and imported. You can't help but feel a twinge of pride for your own weathered cedar rod back home. Sure, it's chipped and go-bitten, but it never needed divine approval to do its job. The temple walls whisper with echoes. This place has measured floods for generations. Pharaohs have stood here, barefoot and anxious, watching the water rise. One legend even says Cleopatra herself consulted the nilometer before declaring an emergency barley rationing. No one knows if it's true, but you're choosing to believe it. Honestly, it's too good a visual to pass up. The scribe finally gives you a nod. Flood steady. Tell your village to prepare for planting. You bow, try not to trip on the steps, and head back toward the sunlit courtyard. As you leave the temple, a gust of hot wind rustles your tunic. Somewhere nearby, a priest chants to Happy, god of the flood, in a voice that sounds like someone gargling sand. You smile, because while the temple nilometers are grand and ancient and full of divine drama, you know that real flood watching happens down at the muddy edge of the field. Bare feet, bent stick, frog chorus, and all dot still. It's nice to know that someone, somewhere, carved your anxieties into stone. You're back in your village, your tunic slightly damp, the smell of wet clay and fish clinging to your skin, when you hear the yelling. Not alarmed yelling, more like that special kind of collective, exasperated shouting that only happens when something has gone horribly wrong, but also slightly hilarious. You jog toward the river, passing a woman waving her arms wildly and muttering curses at the gods. Someone standing knee-deep in the measuring shaft, waving a wooden lid. Overhead dot, and then you see it. The nilometer shaft, the stone-lined pit near the center of town, where you all take your daily readings, is flooded in the worst way. Not with fresh Nile water, not even with too much flood water. No, this is mysteriously disgusting water. Slimy, greenish, smells like despair and fermented duck. You hear someone mutter, "It was the crocodile again." Yep, that tracks. You walk up slowly and peer over the edge. The measuring rod is there, barely visible beneath floating reeds, mud clumps, and what looks suspiciously like a pair of someone's sandals. This shaft wasn't capped last night. Probably someone's nephew got lazy, or drunk, or both, and sometime after midnight, a curious crocodile decided to take a detour from its usual dinner route and explore a new splashy hole. This isn't a joke. Crocodiles real, prehistoric looking. 4-meter-long Nile crocodiles were a constant part of Egyptian river life, sometimes worshipped, sometimes feared, always respected in that please don't eat my children kind of way. The god, Sobek, was literally a crocodile-headed deity, said to protect the people and control the flood. Mixed messaging, honestly. But Sobek's fan club can't help you now. The shaft's a mess. The measurements are useless. The readings from the last 4 days have been swirled into oblivion by what one old farmer dramatically calls the scaly devil of misfortune. You and the others form a kind of crisis circle. What now? No readings mean no predictions. No predictions mean no plan. And no plan means chaos. You need the flood data to know when to plant, when to harvest, when to summon the priest to do his chant and incense routine. The water level is everything, and now it's ruined by a swampy reptile bath. Here's your mainstream fact of the day. Some ancient millimeters were exposed to open elements, especially in smaller settlements. Without covers or grates, these shafts were vulnerable to animals, debris, and even deliberate sabotage. There are records, especially from the late Middle Kingdom, of measuring channels being tampered with during political unrest. Because if you mess with the flood data, you mess with the entire economy. Fun, you offer to help clean it. Someone hands you a reed basket and a ladle. You lean into the shaft with grim determination. The water is colder than expected. Slivier too. There's a clump of algae, a dislodged snail. And yep, there's the croc print in the mud. A perfect 3-toed impression, like some horrible divine stamp. As you scoop, the jokes start. Someone suggests appointing the crocodile as the new priest of measurements. Another guy mimics a high-pitched voice. Praise be to Sobek, keeper of the cupids. Laughter ripples across the group. It helps. Because, let's be honest, this is not your first now-related setback. One teenage boy tries to fish the stick out with a bent spear. The wood's still intact, but the notches are hard to read now, caked with river slime and mysterious gunk. You try brushing it off gently, muttering a quick apology to the spirits of measurement. The stick says 6 cubits, but honestly, who knows at this point? And here's your fringe tidbit. There's an obscure account, possibly more rumor than fact, that a priest once blamed a bad flood year on crocodilian interference. The story claims he tossed a gold amulet into the shaft to appease the river god's chosen guardian. Whether this actually worked is unclear, but local crocodiles were reportedly less aggressive the following year. Historians still argue whether this reflects a real ritual or just someone trying to justify losing their jewelry. The day wears on, and eventually the shaft is cleared, though the water's still murky. You decide to take a baseline reading and mark it as approximate. Everyone nods. Approximate is better than unknown, and definitely better than eaten by reptile. But the event sticks with you, no pun intended. You can't shake the feeling that the flood readings are more fragile than you thought. A single missing lid, a single bored croc, and suddenly your entire season's forecast is souped up back at home. You sit down with your own trusty stick, still muddy from earlier. You clean it carefully, polishing each notch with a scrap of linen. You add a tiny scratch near the 6th cubit, not to mark a reading but to remember the day. The crocodile incident. It'll become part of village lore, you know, someday. Kids will say, that was the year the river got mad and sent Sobek to stir the pot. And yet, as you sip your watered-down beer and listen to the soft ripple of the Nile in the distance, you find yourself smiling, because for all its chaos, the river's still rising, still doing its thing, still playing the long game. Tomorrow, you'll measure again, and if the crocodile comes back, well, maybe bring a bigger lid this time. You're hauling a basket of onions when you hear it low, hushed, conspiratorial chatter drifting from the group of elders sitting near the grain silo. Their voices are laced with that special kind of tension only gossip and taxes can conjure. You slow your steps, pretending to inspect a cracked pot while your ears zero in. Hit 7 cubits this morning. Clear as day. 7. Are you sure? My brother said 6 and 3 fingers. Well, my cousin knows someone who checked the temple shaft at dawn, and it was over 7. That does it. You casually abandon your onions and slip into the crowd already gathering near the village millimeter. That squat stone shaft nestled beside the tamarisk tree. You squint into the water's dark surface, watching it lap just below the 7th notch, close, maybe even slightly above it. Your heart jumps just a little. Why all the fuss? Because 7 cubits is the magic number, the difference between just enough and everything's going to be okay. It's not just a measurement. It's a signal. When the flood reaches 7, it means the gods are smiling, the fields will flourish, and, crucially, the tax collector is about to ruin your afternoon. Because here's how it works. The government doesn't wait to see if your crops grow. They look at the flood readings and assume they will. If the river hits 7 cubits, they start estimating your grain yield with wild optimism and no concern for nuance, and then they arrive armed with scrolls, ledgers, and that bored expression that says, "I didn't choose this job, but I will ruin your week anyway." Mainstream historical fact: ancient Egyptian tax systems were closely tied to the flood levels of the Nile. Officials used millimeter readings to project harvests and set tax quotas. Before a single seed sprouted, the office of the vizier oversaw this system, making millimeter data one of the earliest forms of centralized agricultural forecasting. You hear hoof beats. Too soon, around the bend comes a chariot, not a sleek war one, more of a clunky administrative version with scrolls spilling from a side bag. The tax scribe steps out, robes to clean, eyes scanning the crowd like he's deciding who's lying about barley today. He carries his own measuring rod, thinner and fancier than yours, tipped in bronze and glinting in the sun. 7 cubits confirmed, he announces. Assessments begin next week, and just like that, the gossip goes full throttle. One woman starts arguing that the reading was barely 7, probably 6 in a fat frog. Another man claims the shaft was slanted. The scribe, clearly not new to this game, ignores them all and starts drawing lines in his ledger. You glance at your neighbors. Some are resigned, others are already panicking, because even with a good flood, things can go wrong late planning. Pests, your ghost deciding to eat your wheat again, but the scribe doesn't care. He just sees 7 cubits and dreams of barley taxes. One older man, Hapu, sidles up next to you and mutters, "Maybe next year we dig a new shaft, one that only goes up to 6.5. You snort. That's fraud, survival. He shrugs, honestly. He's not wrong. Historians still argue whether rural flood readings were ever massaged. Some records hint at discrepancies between village readings and temple ones, and let's just say, not all millimeters were calibrated equally. But if you thought that was the end of the drama, buckle up, because now the flood gossip begins in earnest. You pass a group of women pounding grain, chatting animatedly about whether the river reached 7 cubits naturally, or if the priest nudged the numbers to make Pharaoh happy. One of them insists she saw a priest sneak into the shaft before dawn. Another claims the royal astrologer timed the announcement to coincide with a lucky moon phase. A third just shrugs and says, "Mayan says if it hits 8, the frog starts singing." In Latin, you don't know what Latin is, but the mental image lingers as evening falls. You gather with your family to tally your seed reserves. You've got just enough for a full planting if the flood really has peaked. But what if it hasn't? What if it overflows? What if it dips again and never comes back? You glance at your own measuring stick, leaning against the wall, still damp. From this morning's reading, the flood whispers to you even in your dreams. That night, in your half-sleep haze, you imagine the Nile speaking, not with words exactly, but with movements, subtle pulses, the glint of starlight on a water line, a ripple that says, "Not yet," or a stillness that means you should have planted last week. You wake before dawn and stumble to the river bank, heart thudding. You plunge the stick in, eyes tracking the familiar notches, still 7, but now it's just barely 7. You exhale, because here's the truth. The Nile doesn't care about your taxes. It doesn't care about gossip or frogs or whether the priest slipped in an extra notch to save face. The river does what it wants, and you read it, you adjust. You plant, harvest, pray, and try not to let your goat eat your scrolls. Tomorrow, someone will argue again. Maybe the water rose, maybe it fell. Maybe the scribe will return with a new measuring pole that's just a little longer. You'll never really know, but you'll keep checking every morning, because flood sticks may mark the Nile, but flood gossip, that marks the people. The heat's thick today, like someone draped a wet linen over the sun and called it a blanket. You trudge toward the temple steps again, your shoulders aching from hauling water, when you hear a booming voice echoing through the colonnade. The stars have spoken. You sigh. Here we go. Atop the wide stone staircase stands a priest in full regalia, white linen robes, shaved head gleaming, arms raised like he's just invented rain. Behind him, acolytes hold up ceremonial fans, not moving. Them? Of course that's for servants, while the priest continues. The river shall rise by 2 cubits before. The festival of Opet. There's polite applause. Some villagers cheer. One guy next to you mutters, "Bet he read that in the frogs." You chuckle, but you're also a little impressed. Because here's the thing, they're usually right. Or, they seem to be. You settle in on a nearby bench, sipping tepid barley water and watching as more villagers gather. The temple's making a seasonal flood prediction and annual spectacle that blends astronomy, spiritual theater, and a healthy dose of bureaucratic flair. And while most of you have been tracking the flood inch by inch with carved sticks and muddy toes, the priests are using an entirely different tool, the stars, mainstream historical fact. Ancient Egyptian priests relied heavily on astronomy to predict Nile flooding. The heliacal rising of Sirius when the star first becomes visible at dawn was one of their most important markers. Its appearance, around mid-July, aligned with the beginning of the inundation. This stellar event was even celebrated in temple festivals and royal calendars. You glance skyward. The stars, hidden now by sun and heat haze, have already made their move. Sirius has risen. The Nile has begun to swell. The priests are simply announcing it after the fact, or so the skeptics say. But not all predictions are so straightforward. You remember last year's debacle. The priests declared no flood. This season, and half the village panicked, sacrificing everything from incense to a perfectly good chicken. And then the Nile rose higher than it had in a decade. People were thrilled. The priest claimed he meant it would rise unexpectedly, which, in hindsight, was apparently quite clever. Fringe tidbit for the night. Some temple records mention dream divining rituals, where priests would sleep overnight in sacred chambers hoping to receive visions from gods like Thoth or Khnum about the coming flood. What did they see? Historians still argue whether these dreams were symbolic messages or simply the result of sleeping near burning myrrh and moldy figs. Back in the courtyard, you hear the priest declare that the Nile's current level is favorable, but humbly offered by the gods as a test of devotion. Translation, it's fine, but you should probably bring more offerings just in case. And the crowd eating it up. Because nothing gets people motivated like divine uncertainty. You step inside the temple for a moment of shade. Cool air presses against your sunburned skin. In the corner, another priest is checking the millimeter shaft, an official one, carved into the floor with clean lines and a perfect view of the water through a channel. He nods to himself, then scribbles something on a reed scroll. You peek at it, the glyph for 7 cubits and a little fish next to it. Fancy shorthand. Maybe it means steady, maybe it means fishy, you're not sure. You wander out again, past a group of children playing with tiny wooden boats in a puddle. They're pretending to predict the flood till one declares, the gods say it will rise to the sky. Another adds, and crocodiles will rain from the clouds. You smile. Give it time, kids. Someone's bound to write that down and turn it into policy. But as dramatic as the predictions are, you know something most of the crowd doesn't. The priests aren't just guessing, they're watching, measuring, comparing star charts, logging rainfall patterns from upstream even if they don't call it that. They've got networks, couriers, reports from southern territories where rains fall first. Their predictions may look theatrical, but they're built on centuries of careful, if occasionally fudged, observation. Still, not everyone's impressed. Back in the village, your cousin Teddy, local cynic and full-time contrarian, is already venting. They predict floods like I predict go farts, he says, arms crossed. Loud, frequent, and mostly for show. He's not wrong, but he's also still planning his barley based on the priest's announcement. So, take that with a grain of natron. You head to the river again that evening, stick in hand. The water glows orange. In the fading light, kissing the 7th notch again, almost affectionate now. A light breeze carries the smell of wet leaves and distant bread. Somewhere, a frog croaks twice. Maybe a flood omen, maybe just a frog. You jab your stick in, count the notches, and sigh. It's steady, just like the priest said, probably. Or maybe he waited for your measurement before making his grand announcement. You'll never know. That's the magic, though, or the illusion. Either way, it works. Tomorrow, you'll help build the earthen channels, shaping the water's path through your fields. The day after, maybe the tax scribe returns with fresh parchment and less pity. But for now, you stare into the gently lapping Nile, thinking about gods, stars, frogs, and predictions. And maybe, just maybe, you whisper a little thank you to the priest, because deep down, you kind of want him to be right. You wait to silence, and that's the first warning. No frogs, no soft lap of water against the canal stones, no chatter of neighbors at the edge of the field, comparing flood readings over stale bread and hot gossip. just a stillness that sits, the heavily in your chest. You hurry to the river bank, measuring stick in hand, heart already sinking. The sun has barely cleared the hills, casting long golden streaks across the water, or what's left of it. The Nile has stalled. You jab the stick into your usual spot and count. 5 cubits. Not rising, not even moving. You blink. Check again. Same mark. You mutter a curse that's technically blasphemous, but grandfathered in. During emergencies, this isn't just an inconvenient reading. This is bad dot in ancient Egypt. 5 cubits isn't enough. It's the number that means your field will stay dry, your seeds will die in cracked dirt, and your goats will start giving you that don't expect much look. And it gets worse because everyone else is checking, too, within an hour. The gossip spreads like a locust swarm. Rivers gone quiet. Not one finger higher since yesterday. Must be the gods, or Ethiopia, or the tax scribe's bad karma. You all gather at the Nilometer, staring into the shaft like it owes you an apology. The water sits there, motionless, dark and shallow. Even the frogs seem to be holding their breath. Mainstream historical fact, Egypt's agricultural success was entirely dependent on the annual inundation of the Nile. When the floodwaters didn't rise to expected levels, famine often followed. Drought years were recorded in temple annals, sometimes linked to bad omens, failed rituals, or political instability. A woman starts praying under her breath, fingers tracing the air in looping gestures. A boy tosses a carved duck figurine into the river to please Khnum. One man suggests someone angered Sobek again. Another swears it's a punishment for letting the goat into the granary last week. That goat's getting a lot of blame these days. Then someone says it. Maybe the flood isn't coming this year. The words hang in the air, heavy as stone, because when the flood doesn't come, it's not just a water problem. It's a life problem. No water means no silt. No silt means the soil stays dry and hard. No soil, no crops. No crops, no taxes. No taxes, and suddenly the scraps start writing your village down in the problematic column. Worse, no flood means the gods are angry, or absent, or distracted. Either way, it starts the spiral. You remember a story your grandfather told you about the year the flood never came at all. People tried everything, prayers, offerings, dance rituals involving alarmingly sharp sticks. But the river stayed low, grain rotted in the fields, families fled south, dogs ran in packs, and one priest reportedly started sacrificing bread. Not goats, bread. That's how dire it got. French tidbit time. There's a papyrus fragment scholars call the Letter of the Hungry Scribe, where a tax official laments the dry season of shame and claims his writing hand is too weak to scold the people because he hasn't eaten in 3 days. Historians still argue whether the letter is literal or just one very dramatic bureaucrat venting into history. You pace the river bank, stick dragging behind you, thoughts racing. What if this is the year the story repeats? You try to be rational. Maybe it's just delayed. Maybe upstream rains took a detour. Maybe it'll surge tomorrow and make you look ridiculous for panicking. But the silence remains, and it feels wrong. Back at home, the elders call a meeting. They sit cross-legged in a dusty courtyard, debating theories like it's a game of divine clue. Was it the temple? The neglected canal? The fact that no one sacrificed anything better than a dried fig this year? One elder, Meru, suggests rationing grain early just in case. Another says no, it'll panic the workers. A third offers to consult the priest's dream chamber. You suggest checking the upstream tributaries. Everyone stares at you like you just suggested asking. The goat. Night falls heavy, the stars blazing above like cold, silent watchers. You lie awake listening to the absence of river music. Even the mosquitoes seem to be on strike. You try to imagine what happens next. Smaller harvest, thinner bread, longer tax arguments, more desperate prayers. But worst of all, you feel helpless. Because you can poke the river with sticks, carve fancy millimeters, and track every single cubit, and still not control it. You rise early again, hope flickering like a candle in wind. Back to the measuring shaft, back to your stick. You press your palm to the wood and whisper, "Just a finger, just give us a finger." You lower it in. The notches disappear slowly, one by one. You reach the water line. 5 cubits. Exactly. The same. No rise. No fall. The river is holding its breath. And so are you. You're hunched over a clay tablet, scratching numbers with a blunt reed while chewing on the inside of your cheek. The Nile still hasn't budged. 5 cubits, for days. The village is holding together, but just barely, and now whispers are turning into arguments and arguments into plans, dubious ones. Across the courtyard, the elders sit in tight formation, brows furrowed so deep you could plant lentils in them. You know that look. It's the look people get when they're preparing to do something mildly illegal but morally justifiable. You walk over slowly, stick tucked under your arm like a soldier reporting to the front. One of the elders, merry gray beard, sharper eyes, pulls you aside. We need to talk about the millimeter. You glance toward the shaft. Let me guess. You say, you want it to start reading 6 cubits. He nods once, quietly, and there it is. The unspoken truth bubbling to the surface. When the river doesn't rise, sometimes the numbers do not mainstream historical fact. During certain dynastic periods, there's evidence of flood level manipulation. Priests or scribes, perhaps under pressure from local leaders, adjusted the official millimeter readings to maintain tax quotas or social order, whether out of desperation, duty, or pure politics. Those extra fingers weren't always earned honestly. We're not lying, Meru insists. We're adjusting preemptively. It's going to rain in the south. We all feel it. The gods are just late this year. You raise an eyebrow, so we fake the flood level now and hope the water catches up. Meru leans closer. If we don't, the tax collectors will call this a failed district. That means fewer supplies, higher levies, and priests cutting us from the next barley allocation. This isn't fraud. This is protection, sure, but it still feels dirty. Like cheating at Senate because your kids are watching and you can't afford another turnip-free week. You sigh. How many cubits are we adjusting? 1. He says, just 1. From 5 to 6. That's reasonable. Barely a toe's difference, and so begins the quietest, most desperate renovation project your village has ever seen. That night, under cover of darkness and goat bleats, you slip into the millimeter shaft with 3 others. One holds a lantern, another has a pot of wet clay and a smooth spatula. You, unfortunately, are the one chosen to get wet. You descend into the shaft, the air cool and still. The water laps against your calves, oblivious to the treachery afoot. You count the notches carved in the shaft wall: 1 cubit, 2, 3, 4, 5. You add a smear of clay just below the 5th mark. Then carefully carve a new 6 just a finger's width higher. It's subtle, believable, just enough to pass as the Nile, being slightly generous overnight. When you emerge, soaked and mildly ashamed, the elder slaps your back like you just saved the world. You'll see, he says, we'll be planning in no time, but it doesn't stop there. The next morning, someone notices the new level and shouts it across the square, 6 cubits, by my stick. And just like that, the gossip machine shifts into reverse. There's hope again. A second elder sends word to the tax office that your village has reached planting height. Priests begin preparing the official blessing. You stand at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, trying to figure out if you've done something clever or catastrophic. Because with 1 extra cubit comes expectation. The scribes arrive sooner than planned, riding mules that look just as judgmental as their riders. The lead scribe, round, sweating, deeply unimpressed, inspects the millimeter. He leans down, measures carefully, squints at the carved mark. Then he nods. 6. The village breathes. Then he says, prepare to deliver your quotas in 30 days. And don't be late this year. And the village chokes. Because suddenly, the lie is locked in. Official, sealed with scribe spit and tax math. Now you have the plan. You have to harvest. And if the flood doesn't come, if the gods don't hurry up with their rain plan, you'll be taxed on grain that never existed. A woman nearby whispers, maybe the fake flood scared the real one off. Another jokes, let's fake another cubit and hope it rains guilt. You don't laugh. You meet with the elders again that night. There's no going back now. So they start organizing backup plans. First up, dig deeper irrigation channels maybe. You can stretch the existing water further. You spend your days waist deep in mud, carving narrow canals like veins from a dying heart. Then you help rearrange seed storage, placing the best grain near the cooler cellars so it doesn't spoil before it's even sown. Then come the bribes, small ones at first. A jar of beer for the priest, a goat for the visiting tax officer, a necklace for the scribe's assistant. Nothing outrageous, just gestures. Little reminders that your village is cooperative, generous, blessedly forgetful. And here's your fringe fact of the night. There's evidence that some ancient Egyptian Districts intentionally submitted different flood data to rival their neighbors, a form of regional misdirection. Historians still argue whether this was strategic manipulation or just communities trying to one-up each other with imaginary water levels. Either way, the paper trail is suspiciously moist. Back at the river, you check your own measuring stick, still 5 cubits, not even a whisper higher. You don't adjust it, you just stare at it, long and hard, and say, just catch up, please. Because the only thing more dangerous than no flood is promising a flood that never comes. You step carefully into the stone corridor, sandals slapping against the cool floor as you enter a space unlike anything you've seen in your scrappy little village. High above, a narrow slit in the ceiling allows a single shaft of sunlight to cut across the gloom, catching dust like it's golden smoke. Ahead of you, a towering marble column rising from the center of a circular pool, its surface marked with precisely carved cubits and fingers, every line crisp as if drawn this morning. You've come a long way from your go-nod measuring stick. This is the capital, the real deal, and this is the millimeter, the grand one, built from limestone, sycamore wood, and centuries of obsession. You're not even sure if you're allowed to be here, but you're walking with an official grain broker now, and apparently that counts for something. Stand there, he says, gesturing toward the edge. Not too close. We don't want another incident, right? You edge backward, remembering the story he told on the way here about the ambitious village scribe who leaned afar into the shaft trying to verify a reading and ended up inventing the first recorded belly flop in the state water. Mainstream historical fact. As Egyptian dynasties advanced, millimeters evolved from simple measuring rods into architectural marvels. Some of the most complex designs, like the Rhode Island millimeter in modern-day Cairo, featured columns calibrated with cubit markers, stone staircases descending into river-fed chambers, and even vault ceilings. These structures weren't just tools, they were symbols of administrative power and religious control. You stare at the column. It's stunning, carved from a single stone, its base submerged in Nile water channeled through underground tunnels. Around it, inscriptions record centuries of floods. Year 6 of Thutmose, 8 cubits. Year 21 of Ramesses, 7 and 1 finger. Year 2 of Pharaoh, who was briefly important. That last one is suspiciously scratched out. You run your hand along the wall, cold, damp, and strangely intimate. This place has memory, not just data, but emotion. You imagine the priests, kings, and scribes who stood here. Maybe they worried like you. Maybe they prayed. Maybe one of them also added an extra cubit during a bad year and hoped no one noticed. The grain broker speaks again. Measurements from this millimeter determine the tax assessments for 3 nomes. Whatever we report here ripples outward crops, storage plans, royal treasuries. So, yeah, no pressure. You ask him how they keep it accurate. He grins like you've asked a personal question about his mother's bread recipe. He says. First, you clean the column daily. Mold throws off the reading. Then, 3 readings, dawn, midday, sunset. If they match, you log the number. If they don't, he shrugs. You guess which one looks better. You raise an eyebrow. Kidding, he says, with a wink that suggests he very much is not kidding. Then he adds, once, a high priest declared the reading at 8 cubits before even entering the chamber. Claimed a dream told him, coincidentally, that year's taxes broke records. French tidbit alert, in certain periods, readings from official millimeters were kept secret for several days, giving temple and royal authorities time to prepare statements or to reinterpret the numbers depending on political needs. Historians still argue whether these delays were logistical necessities or strategic manipulations. You walk slowly around the chamber, watching the water shimmer below the column. This is more than a tool, it's an oracle, a data temple, a place where numbers gain weight. And each cubit rise could mean the difference between royal praise and farmer rebellion, and yet, the math remains the same. 7 cubits, good. 9, dangerous. 5, panic with dignity. Still, standing here, the numbers feel different, heavier, official. If your village stick says 5 and this one says 6, guess which reading matters? Spoiler, it's the one carved into polished stone, surrounded by priests with opinions. As you stare down into the water, something odd catches your eye, a faint groove, maybe a repaired section. You point. What's that? The broker leans over. Yes, the emperor notch. During Roman occupation, One governor insisted on adding a cubit to the column because he didn't trust the Egyptian measurements, said the river flowed differently under Roman eyes. You snort and did it. Nope, but he got his taxes early. So who's to say? You sit quietly for a moment, letting the marbles chill seep into your spine. This grand millimeter isn't better than your village stick, just fancier, more intimidating, more political, but in both places. The same truth bubbles beneath the surface. You can measure the water, but you can't control it. You return to the village a week later, dusty and sore from the journey. Everyone wants to know what the grand millimeter said. 6 cubits. You tell them. The elders nod. That matches ours, right? Someone asks, hope laced into the words like honey and tea. You hesitate, then smile. Close enough. And in that moment, you realize something strange. For all the stone and ritual and divine approval, it's the memory of muddy footprints beside a hand-carved stick that still feels the most real. That flood measurement smudged, imperfect, whispered in jokes and prayers, that's the one that actually fed your family. Maybe that's what the pharaohs never quite understood. Fancy columns impress, but it's the quiet little flood sticks, the ones bent by use, not carved by decree, that keep Egypt alive. The Nile smells different after harvest. Not bad, just satisfied. The bite of silt has softened. The frogs have stopped their nightly opera. The banks are lined with bundled stalks and tired people. You walk slowly through the fading light, your sandals kicking up little puffs of dry soil, your measuring stick tapping your leg like a drumbeat of closure. It's been a long season, but now something strange is happening. You're seeing your flood stick everywhere except not your stick, other ones, copies, variations. A boy running by with a toy millimeter carved into a piece of driftwood. A merchant showing off a brass replica he claims is just like the one at the Temple of Philae. Some artisan is even selling miniature millimeter charms now 1 cubit tall, perfect for hanging around your neck. If you're the kind of person who likes your agricultural forecasting to be wearable, you chuckle. Because what was once a private tool, just a carved rod in your muddy hand, is now part of culture, part of history, a thing that somehow outlasts the harvest it measured. Mainstream historical fact. Millimeters, or water gauges used to measure the height of the Nile flood, were used continuously for over 3,000 years, surviving the rise and fall of pharaohs, dynasties, and even empires. They were so important that some were maintained during Greek, Roman, and Islamic rule, making them one of the most long-lasting scientific instruments in human history. You sit by the river, your feet dangling into a side canal that smells faintly of leftover onions and fish scales. Your stick lies across your knees. It's worn now, edges smoothed by constant use, the notches fading just slightly at the top. You run your thumb along the 7 cubit mark, the ideal flood, and wonder how many people, before you felt the exact same groove beneath their fingers. Then someone calls out from across the field, hey, bring your stick, we're checking. The winter channels, still useful. You head over, joining a small group inspecting the irrigation ditches. The flood's been generous this year, not overwhelming, not stingy, just right. Most of the fields got their share of water. A few didn't. Everyone blames the crooked canal that hasn't been fixed since your great-uncle fell into it drunk and declared a cursed as the farmers argue about which bend needs straightening. You walk a little ways off to a small shrine near the edge of the village. There, carved in rough stone, is a depiction of Khnum holding a pot of water, its surface engraved with cubit lines. It's simple, sweetly primitive, a tribute to the river, or maybe to the flood stick itself. Someone's painted a new line above the pot's rim, a joke, maybe, or a prayer for next year. You touch it lightly and feel the stone's warmth. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some scholars believe millimeters were used ceremonially, even outside of flood season, blessed, cleaned, or consulted for other decisions, like canal construction or temple expansion. Others say that's nonsense, that the sticks were just tools. But historians still argue whether the reverence shown to them was practical or spiritual or both. You look down at your stick, now resting in your hands like an heirloom. You think of your grandfather, who used it before you, your father, who added his own notches, the flood year he bragged about until he died, the drought year no one talked about except in code. You've started carving your own son's name into the bottom, just lightly. He's only 6, but last week you caught him poking the river with a reed and shouting, 7 cubits, like he was born to measure destiny. You smile, because the flood stick has outlived so many things: kings, wars, Forgotten temples swallowed by sand, and yet here it is, still poking the water, still making people argue, still shaping taxes, timing planning, and sparking little superstitions no one admits to believing die in the distance. You hear music, drums, and flutes. The flood festival has started. The priest is probably giving a dramatic speech about the generosity of happy, while children run around with mud-streaked faces and offerings made from stale bread. Shaped like boats, you rise, tuck the stick under your arm, and head toward the sound. Because yes, the Nile is the source of life, but it's the humble flood stick etched with hope, handled with care, passed from hand to hand that turns the flood into a future. You're lying in bed now, the weight of ancient dust slowly lifting from your chest. The river fades in your mind, its water smoothing out, slipping past your thoughts like silk over stone. You feel the shape of the carved stick in your hand. Still only it's not there anymore, just memory now, a trace of what grain on your palm. Fading with each breath, the flood has come and gone. The harvest isn't, the air is cooler tonight, and the frogs have gone quiet, just for a little while. Maybe they're resting, too, or listening, like you are. For that low hum the river makes when no one's looking, that steady pulse beneath all things, you remember how it rose first in fingers, then in cubits, then in hope, and you remember when it didn't, when people held their breath, when you did, too. But it always came back, maybe not on time, maybe not the way you wanted, but it came, and that's enough for now, so let it go. Let the measurements drift away, let the temple fade into the dark. Let the frogs curl into the mud and the priests snuff their lamps. The Nile will wait for you. And in the morning, maybe you'll find another notch carved just a little higher than before. Sleep well, river watcher. You've earned it, in the script. Sweet dreams.